Hey Vainglorians, this is Gadienton from BrokenMyth.net, and I'm here to present to you the preview for Update 1.14 of Vainglory. You can obtain a full listing of all the changes from the Vainglory website, however, I will be selecting the most significant changes and covering them in depth. First, I'm sure everyone is curious to hear what might have changed on their favorite heroes, so let's take a look. Kestrel was probably one of the biggest bullies of the previous update, particularly in the early game. Thankfully, she's been toned down a bit in this update. A lot of these changes revolve around her Glimmer Shot, which is Kestrel's A ability. First, the recharge time for Glimmer Shot arrows has been increased from 3.3 seconds to 4 seconds, so you still get the thrill of spamming arrows, just not as frequently. Also, if you see an enemy Kestrel who runs out of arrows, you now have a much larger window of time to be able to take her out. Second, the hitbox in Glimmer Shot has been reduced in size by just a bit. This means that in order to hit your intended target, expect that you will need to be a little bit more accurate with your Glimmer Shots from now on. Lastly, they reduced the base splash damage of Glimmer Shot but increased its CP ratio. They also reduced the weapon ratio of Glimmer Shot from 125% at all ranks to be weaker in the early to mid game but slightly stronger in the late game. This should sufficiently reduce the damage output of weapon power Kestrel builds, more so in the early game, but give a boost to crystal power builds. I really hope that this latter change creates some more diversity in the Kestrel builds we see out in the fold. Ardan has been a favored roam pick in competitive play for multiple updates now, and in 1.14 he's been toned down a bit, possibly giving other roam heroes the opportunity to shine more. For Ardan's Vanguard ability, the range has been reduced from 9 to 7. Now, whether an Ardan player is trying to escape or to leap to the aid of an ally, he'll need to be more careful about his positioning, as you can see here from this diagram. Previously, the health ratio on Vanguard was reduced from 50% to 25%. Now, the health ratio is being reduced again from 25% to 15%. This lower health ratio places much more emphasis on the base shielding ability of Vanguard. Prior to this change, Ardan players haven't had really much of an incentive to max their Vanguard first, so this might be a tipping point where we start maxing A instead of B first. Now let's take a moment to talk about Ardan's Gauntlet. It's receiving a very interesting change that I believe is neither a buff or a nerf. First, when he activates the ability, he will immediately begin telegraphing the location of where the Gauntlet will land. This will provide both teammates as well as opponents more forewarning. However, Gauntlet walls can now land on top of your opponent's heads, instantly stunning them rather than displacing them. I'm sure this latter feature will be a fun source of animated GIFs and YouTube videos in the near future. The final hero I want to talk about is Skye. She was yet another bully in the previous update, particularly when built with crystal power. To help reduce the damage output of a blue Skye, the CP ratio on Surrey Strike has been chopped down from 150% to 100%. Additionally, they raised the cooldown on Surrey Strike's overdrive from 5 seconds to 5.5 seconds. While these changes will be a decent reduction to the burst damage from Surrey Strike, you can still expect Forward Barrage to be the greatest threat from a blue Skye. Now, speaking of Forward Barrage, Red Skye wasn't seeing enough love and attention from players, so there were two changes made to Forward Barrage that are specific to weapon power builds. First, the weapon power ratio has received a small increase, and second, the critical damage bonus has received a large increase. As clarification of how this works, Forward Barrage does additional damage equal to 210% of your weapon power. Then, if you critically strike with this damage, you get the normal 50% bonus damage, which every hero gets, and then your Forward Barrage can get up to an additional 150% bonus critical damage on top of that, bringing the total up to 200% bonus damage. When you put this all together, you're looking at some big numbers. Overall, the hope is that by lowering the power of Blue Skye and increasing the power of Red Skye, we will see some additional item build diversity in the fold and maybe even shake up the meta a bit. There's one additional change that will directly impact several heroes and hero builds. The item breaking point has been redesigned. Previous to 1.14, Breaking Point could often be used as the one weapon to rule them all. It gave you all the key statistics that a weapon build requires: attack speed, weapon power, critical chance, critical damage. In fact, there were many scenarios where you could buy all defensive items, making you practically indestructible, and add in a Breaking Point as your only offensive item. This will no longer be the case. So here's the details. First, you now only gain weapon power from breaking point stacks. Every stack is worth 10 weapon power. To gain your first stack, you need to do 125 weapon damage to an enemy hero. Now keep in mind, this is post-armor damage, so if your opponents build lots of armor, you'll probably build stacks more slowly. After you've built your first stack, each additional stack will require 5 additional weapon damage. So stack 2 requires 130 damage, stack 3 requires 135, and so on. However, while building stacks gets progressively more difficult, keep in mind that your attacks are progressively getting more powerful as well. As 2 final revisions, after you've ceased to attack enemy heroes for 2 seconds, your stacks will then begin to decay rather rapidly at a rate of 2 per second, and then finally you can only have a maximum of 25 stacks. So the big question on everyone's mind, how does this affect things? First of all, you don't want to build this item first or by itself. You simply won't have enough weapon damage to sufficiently build stacks. I can't emphasize enough that this is no longer a standalone weapon power item. If you want to be successful with the new breaking point, you will need to purchase other weapon power items first. Second, if you're looking to add some burst damage to your weapon power build, there's only 2 tier 3 items left that provide those statistics now, and that's the Tyrant's Monocle and the Tornado Trigger. Third, what's kind of unique and exciting about this new breaking point is that any ability that does weapon damage or has a weapon ratio to it can contribute to the building of stacks. So for example, Rona's ult could not only generate breaking point stacks, but a well-placed ult in the middle of an enemy team could potentially generate 6 or more stacks per second. This leads us into our next point. There's no limit to how quickly you can build stacks. This could be interesting on a hero such as Saw, who can rapidly dish out tons of weapon damage, but with the previous breaking point could only ever build 1 stack per second. Lastly, melee heroes take more risks when they enter combat, so the previous breaking point was stronger for melee heroes than it was for ranged heroes. However, now ranged heroes such as Ringo can stay on the fringes of a fight and still build the same breaking point stacks as a melee hero without taking the same risks. Now, we haven't even talked about the biggest changes yet. Many key features and mechanics of the Halcyon Fold have been changed significantly, and it is bound to change how we play the game. First, let's talk about the jungle. In general, the jungle camps in 1.14 will now cause some serious pain. This will be particularly difficult for any heroes with a slow jungle clear time. As you can see on the left, those jungle minions are taking huge chunks out of Taka's health bar. Also, when you're comparing health bars, keep in mind that the Taka on the left is well into his first Halcyon potion, while the Taka on the right is just starting his. In the end, the 1.14 Taka is ready to be one-shotted by an enemy player, while the Taka on the right is still in decent combat condition. Lastly, late-game jungle camps are vicious, and carries with little defense need to beware. Watch how quickly Petal's health goes down. She doesn't even stand a chance. Now, as a consistent theme, the gold miner now hits a lot harder too, in fact, much harder. Unless you're playing Cruel, you're probably going to need at least one teammate to help you out. And as you can see, the 1.14 gold miner is going to kill off Koshka while it still has half its health, and the Koshka on the right is able to finish him off without dying. Probably the most game-changing update you should be aware of is that the gold miner is now neutral at all times. Traditionally, competitive teams will take the gold miner in the early game and control it by feeding it minion candy and using it as a 4th member of their team. You can no longer do this. You can no longer control the gold mine and collect a payout at regular intervals. That money is always up for grabs by either team and will be a constant objective throughout the first 15 minutes of the game. Along with this change, you no longer need to control the gold mine to feed it candy. Either team can do this at any time. Keep in mind, however, that if you supercharge the gold miner with a minion candy, he will not only be tougher for your opponents, he will also be tougher for you. There are a few final changes that will make the game more fun and exciting for us. First, in the late game, sometimes games can seem to drag a little in between Kraken respawns, so the respawn timer has been reduced. This should help keep the endgame as action-packed as possible. Second, the new kill bounty system introduced in 1.12 has seemed to favor late-game compositions just a little too much. So the bonus gold has been reduced for teams who are behind. This should create more balance among team comps that hit their stride at different parts of the game. Last but not least, your death timer will now get reduced by 15% of its total each time you lose a turret while you're dead. As an example, if your death timer is 60 seconds, each turret you lose will chop 9 seconds off of your weight. This will help prevent some late game scenarios where you get aced and lose all of your turrets before you can respawn, which is a little bit tragic, so hopefully that won't happen anymore. This has been your in-depth preview of the Vainglory Update 1.14. For all the best Vainglory news, analysis, and strategy, please take a moment to visit brokenmyth.net. Thank you.